Abina was the pride of her small town, not just for her striking beauty, but for the way her presence could light up a room. Her dark skin glowed like polished ebony under the sun, and her smile revealed perfectly white teeth that could charm anyone. Her laughter, soft and melodic, often left people wishing to hear it just one more time. Elders would whisper about her, and younger girls envied her grace and natural allure. But Abina's beauty was both her blessing and her curse. While it drew people to her, it also shaped her outlook on life. She believed her beauty was all she needed. Hard work? A trade? A career? She dismissed such notions, claiming her face was her passport to a life of ease and luxury. Her parents, both hardworking farmers, were deeply concerned. Abina, her mother would often plead, "Don't think your beauty alone will sustain you. Learn a trade. Build a future for yourself." But Abina would scoff. "Mama, you're just jealous. You think because your life was hard, mine has to be too." Her words stung, but her mother remained patient, hoping one day Abina would see reason. Suitors lined up at their door, each hoping to win Abina's heart. Young men, old men, farmers, traders, and even the town's wealthiest merchant, all were turned away. Abina's standards were high, too high for the humble men of her community. "I'll marry a man who owns mansions and drives cars, not someone who smells of fish or cassava," she would declare to her friends, laughing at the thought of marrying someone who couldn't elevate her status. Her parents prayed silently for her to find wisdom, but Abina remained steadfast. Her beauty was her ticket out of poverty, and she intended to use it. One bright afternoon, while Abina was shopping at the town market, a convoy of sleek, black cars pulled up. Heads turned as a tall, distinguished man stepped out. He was impeccably dressed in a crisp white suit with gold cufflinks that glinted in the sun. He moved with the confidence of someone who was used to getting what he wanted. It was Mr. Kofi, a businessman known throughout the region. Though he was in his late 50s, his wealth and status made him a figure of intrigue. Stories of his opulence were legendary. Mansions in 3 cities, a fleet of luxury cars, and businesses spanning industries no one in the town could even name. When his eyes fell on Abina, he smiled. "Excuse me, young lady," he said, his voice deep and commanding. "Are you Abina?" Abina's heart skipped a beat. She had heard of Mr. Kofi, but never imagined he would notice her. She smiled demurely, feigning modesty, though her mind was already racing. "Yes, I am. How can I help you, sir?" "I couldn't help but notice you," he began. "Your beauty is remarkable. I'd like to get to know you better. May I invite you to my home for dinner?" Abina's friends, who had been eavesdropping, gasped. A dinner invitation from Mr. Kofi was the talk of dreams. Without hesitation, she agreed, though she pretended to hesitate, enjoying the looks of envy on her friends' faces. That evening, Abina was escorted to Kofi's mansion. The gates alone were taller than any building she'd ever seen, and the mansion itself was grander than anything she'd imagined. Chandeliers sparkled like diamonds, and marble floors gleamed beneath her feet. She felt like she had stepped into a fairy tale. During dinner, Kofi spoke about his life and achievements, but Abina barely listened. Her eyes darted around the luxurious dining room, drinking in the paintings, the golden cutlery, and the silk curtains. This was the life she wanted, and she was determined to make it hers. As the evening wore on, Kofi leaned forward and said, "Abina, I want you to be my wife." Abina's heart raced. She had waited for this moment her entire life. But then he added, "There's one condition. We must enter a blood covenant. It's a sacred bond that ensures you will remain mine forever." The word covenant made Abina pause. She didn't fully understand its implications, but her desire for wealth drowned out her caution. She nodded slowly. "If that's what you want, I agree." Kofi smiled, pleased. He summoned a spiritualist to oversee the ritual. Abina was hesitant as a small cut was made on her palm and Kofi's. Their blood mixed in a ceremonial bowl. The spiritualist chanted strange words as they made their vows. Abina barely listened, her eyes still fixated on the luxury around her. The ceremony ended, and Kofi kissed her hand. "You're mine now, Abina. Forever." She smiled, thinking only of the riches she would soon enjoy. Within weeks, Kofi visited her parents to ask for her hand in marriage. Her father, uneasy about the age difference, hesitated, but her mother, seeing Abina's eagerness, agreed. The wedding was a grand affair, with dignitaries, exotic dishes, and decorations that dazzled the entire town. Abina felt like a queen as she walked down the aisle, never once considering the cost of the covenant she had entered. She moved into Kofi's mansion, her dreams fulfilled. But beneath the surface of her newfound luxury, an unseen shadow loomed, waiting to claim its due. Abina's life after her wedding was everything she had ever dreamed of. In Kofi's mansion, there was no task too small to be done for her. A team of chefs prepared her meals, maids attended to her every need, and drivers were always on call to take her wherever she desired. For months, Abina basked in the glory of her new life, enjoying the fruits of a wealth she felt she rightfully deserved. Kofi, though much older, treated her well. He was generous with gifts, designer clothes, sparkling jewelry, and even a luxury car that had her name engraved on the seats. He rarely asked much of her, content to see her happy and adorned in finery. To Abina, love wasn't important. As long as she was surrounded by luxury and treated like royalty, she felt she had won. But not all dreams last forever. One chilly morning, Kofi complained of chest pains during breakfast. Abina, sipping her imported coffee, barely glanced up. "You should see a doctor," she said nonchalantly, not fully comprehending the severity of the situation. By the time she looked up, Kofi had collapsed onto the marble floor. Servants scrambled to help him, but by the time the ambulance arrived, Kofi was gone. Abina stood frozen in disbelief. Her husband was dead. The grand mansion suddenly felt hollow as the reality of widowhood set in. She feared what would happen to her now that Kofi was gone. Would his family take the wealth from her? Would she be thrown out? Her fears were soon quelled, however. During the reading of the will, it was revealed that Kofi had left everything to her: the house, the businesses, and every penny of his vast fortune. His family, wealthy in their own right, didn't contest it. They attended the funeral, exchanged polite condolences, and left her alone with her inheritance. Abina was now not just rich, she was fabulously wealthy. She told herself it was the life she deserved. She began living even more extravagantly than before, throwing lavish parties and spending nights at exclusive clubs in the city. Men started circling her like moths to a flame, but none of them seemed to stay long. At first, she thought they were intimidated by her wealth, but soon the encounters began to grow strange. The first man she brought home, a suave businessman she'd met at a club, suddenly froze during their evening together. His face turned pale, and he muttered something incoherent about feeling a dark presence in the room. Without explanation, he grabbed his clothes and fled into the night. It was odd, but Abina brushed it off. But when it happened with the second man, and the third, she began to worry. Every single man she invited in her life would leave abruptly, looking terrified. Then came the dreams. At first, the dreams were faint and strange, but they grew more vivid with each passing night. Abina would find herself in her bed, unable to move, as a shadowy figure loomed over her. Its touch was cold and unsettling, but it felt real, too real. She would wake up drenched in sweat, her heart racing as though she had just run a marathon. The figure whispered in a voice that sent chills down her spine, "You are mine." Each morning after the dreams, she felt exhausted, as though she had truly lived through the nightmarish encounters. Worse, her once lively home began to feel eerily quiet. Shadows in the corners of rooms seemed to stretch and move when she wasn't looking, and she often heard faint whispers that stopped when she turned her head. Abina tried to distract herself with parties and outings, but nothing could shake the growing fear gnawing at her. One day, she confided in an older friend, Afua, who had a reputation for being wise. "Something strange is happening," Abina began hesitantly. "Men run from me. I have these terrible dreams, and I feel like I'm being watched, even when I'm alone." Afua's expression darkened. "These are not ordinary things, Abina. Are you sure there's nothing from your past? Nothing unusual that might explain this?" Abina hesitated. The memory of the blood covenant with Kofi flashed in her mind, but she quickly dismissed it. How could that have anything to do with what was happening? She shook her head and gave Afor a weak smile. No, nothing. But the nightmares only got worse. One night, she awoke feeling an intense pressure on her chest, as though someone was pinning her down. When she opened her eyes, she saw Kofi's face, pale and ghostly, staring back at her. "You are mine, Abina," he hissed. "No one else will ever have you." She screamed, and the figure vanished, but the fear stayed with her. Desperate for answers, she returned to her parents' home. She hadn't visited in months, but she didn't care about the embarrassment of returning now. Her mother welcomed her in, sensing the fear in her daughter's eyes. "Abina, what's wrong?" her mother asked, concerned. Abina broke down, recounting the strange events, the fleeing men, and the terrifying dreams. Her mother listened quietly before nodding gravely. "We must seek help. I know someone who can give us answers." The next day, they visited a respected pastor in the neighboring town. The pastor prayed over Abina, and after a long session, he opened his eyes and sighed deeply. "Child," he began, "you are bound by a spiritual covenant. The blood covenant you made with your late husband ties your soul to his, even in death. He still claims you, and he will not let you go unless the covenant is broken." Abina's jaw dropped. She had nearly forgotten about the ritual. "But he's dead," she protested. "How can he still?" "The spiritual realm does not work like the physical," the pastor explained. "The covenant still binds you, and as long as you hold on to the wealth he left you, the ties will remain. You must let go of everything he gave you, his house, his businesses, his money. Only then can we begin to break the bond." Abina recoiled at the suggestion. "Give up the wealth? Are you serious? After all I've been through, you want me to go back to being poor?" She turned to her mother, anger flashing in her eyes. "Mama, this is why I never listened to you. You want to ruin my life. This is just jealousy." Her mother's face fell, but she said nothing. Abina stormed out, convinced that no one understood her. That night, she vowed to forget the pastor's words. She dressed up, headed to the city, and decided to live her life as she pleased. But the consequences of her defiance were only beginning. Abina's frustration with her mother and the pastor's advice boiled over as she entered the club that night. The thumping bass of the music and the dim, swirling lights distracted her from the eerie events of the past few months. She poured herself into the party, drinking one expensive cocktail after another, dancing with abandon, and basking in the attention of the men who couldn't take their eyes off her. Here, in the heart of the city's nightlife, she felt powerful again. If no one believed her, she would drown her fears in wealth and revelry. Among the sea of admirers, one man stood out. He was tall, charming, and confident, and unlike the others, he didn't seem intimidated by her wealth or reputation. His name was Kwesi, and Abina found his confidence refreshing. They flirted, laughed, and shared drinks. As the night deepened, she leaned into him and whispered an invitation to come back to her mansion. He agreed without hesitation. Abina told herself that this time would be different. Kwesi was bold, unshaken by the aura of fear that seemed to follow her. Perhaps he would stay, and her nightmares would finally end. They returned to the mansion, tipsy and giddy. Abina poured them both drinks, the tension between them simmering. But as the night went on, Kwesi's demeanor began to shift. His laughter grew strained, his gaze distant. Abina noticed him glancing around the room, his expression darkening, as if he could see something she couldn't. "What's wrong?" she asked, trying to keep her voice light. Kwesi didn't respond. Instead, he stood abruptly, his movements jerky and unnatural. When he turned to face her, his eyes were wide and filled with terror. But it wasn't Kwesi's voice that came from his mouth. It was deeper, colder, and hauntingly familiar. "Abina," the voice growled. "You are mine." Abina's breath caught in her throat as the realization hit her. It was Kofi's voice. Kwesi, or whatever had possessed him, lunged toward her, gripping her arms with a strength that felt inhuman. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light as he hissed, "Did you think you could escape me? Every man you bring here will suffer. Every man you touch will pay. You are mine forever." Abina screamed, struggling to free herself. She felt the cold grip of Kofi's presence as Kwesi's possessed body dragged her across the room. He threw her against the wall, his voice echoing through the house. "You will never belong to anyone else." Summoning all her strength, Abina pushed him away and scrambled for the door. She ran into the night, her screams piercing the darkness. By the time she reached her parents' house, she was trembling, her face pale and streaked with tears. Her mother opened the door and pulled her inside. "Abina, what's wrong?" she asked, alarmed. Abina collapsed into her arms. "Mama, I was wrong. I was so wrong. Please help me." The next morning, Abina, her mother, and her father returned to the pastor. This time, she didn't argue, didn't resist, and didn't hold on to her pride. She fell to her knees, sobbing, "Pastor, I was wrong to doubt you. I was wrong to doubt my parents. Please help me. I'll do whatever it takes to break this curse." The pastor looked at her with a mixture of sternness and compassion. "Child, breaking this covenant will not be easy. You've tied yourself to Kofi in the spiritual realm, and those ties are strong. You must let go of all the wealth he gave you. His house, his businesses, his money, all of it. These things are physical anchors to the covenant." Abina hesitated for a moment, but the memory of Kofi's ghostly voice and the terror she felt the previous night left no room for doubt. "I'll do it," she whispered. "I'll give it all up." It took weeks to finalize the process. Abina signed over Kofi's businesses and properties to his family, explaining her decision as wanting to honor his legacy. She moved out of the mansion and returned to her parents' humble home. The adjustment was difficult. She had grown used to luxury, and now she found herself sharing a small room with her younger siblings. The pastor led her through a rigorous process of fasting, prayers, and spiritual cleansing. Each day, Abina felt the weight of the covenant pressing on her, but she also felt the beginnings of relief, like a faint light at the end of a dark tunnel. Her parents joined her in the prayers, fasting alongside her and encouraging her to remain strong. The final stage involved a symbolic act of renunciation. The pastor instructed Abina to take the last remaining item from Kofi's wealth, a gold bracelet she had kept, and bury it in the ground while reciting prayers to sever the bond. As she buried the bracelet, Abina felt a surge of emotion. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "I am free." The process was not instantaneous, but over the next few weeks, the nightmares ceased. The oppressive atmosphere that had haunted her lifted, and the house felt lighter. Abina no longer felt Kofi's presence, and the men who once fled from her began to approach her again. She was finally free, but the experience had profoundly changed her. Abina no longer saw wealth or luxury as the ultimate goal. She now understood how hollow those pursuits had been. Determined to rebuild her life on a foundation of purpose, she approached her mother, humbly asking to learn the art of tailoring. Her once delicate hands, accustomed to holding champagne glasses and admiring jewelry, now fumbled with thick fabrics and sharp needles. Each day brought new challenges, but with her mother's patient guidance, she began to appreciate the value of persistence. For the first time, she experienced the quiet pride of creating something with her own hands. The glamorous lifestyle she once craved, filled with dazzling parties and indulgence, was replaced with simplicity and purpose. Mornings were spent helping with household chores, and afternoons in the sewing room brought a steady rhythm of fulfillment. The hum of the sewing machine became a comforting melody, a reminder of the honest work she was now committed to. Slowly, Abina discovered that true peace wasn't found in luxury or riches, but in the strength to craft her own path, one stitch at a time. For the first time in her life, she felt truly free. Abina's story became a cautionary tale in her community, a lesson about greed, pride, and the dangers of taking shortcuts to success. Though she had paid a heavy price for her choices, she emerged stronger and wiser, determined to rebuild her life with her own two hands. And so, the beautiful Abina learned that true wealth comes not from riches, but from freedom, humility, and the strength to live a life of purpose.